I'm greatly honored to be invited by President Cardoso, by the organizers, to speak at this famous institute in São Paulo. I will talk to you today about climate change, sustainable development, and responsible investment. As we all know, among the world's ever greater independent population of now 7.2 billion people, we face very enormous challenges. Climate change, and I would add to that natural resource scarcity, which is looming. These are megatrends poorly understood and often ignored. Systemic risks associated with our intertwined communication, finance, trade, and security systems. And growing strains, I'm just coming from Washington, on our local and global governance systems functioning effectively to address these challenges. We are at a critical juncture and running out of time on climate. The threatening and very real scenarios, from climate change to loss of biodiversity, topsoil, forest cover, water, compel us to act now. The window of opportunity is closing. And as a member of the business community, I will focus particularly on the leadership and contributions the private sector can and should provide. The UNFCCC climate negotiations have produced no significant results to date. Could then the business sector make commitments, provide leadership to support reaching a global climate agreement in Paris in 2015? I believe yes. So I will try to outline a positive sustainability vision, point to developments that show this is feasible, and recommend action to achieve it. I will focus my remarks to be selective on 4 areas. One, very key, energy, policies and steps to make the future of clean energy technologies even more promising. 2, climate change and natural resource scarcity, and their link to cities, urbanization, land use, the necessary actions here. 3, how indeed the private sector can benefit economically and contribute to improved, what I call environmental, social, and governance sustainability performance. It's very much a term used now also in the financial community called ESG, and for short, environmental, social, and governance sustainability performance of its activities and investments, and the impact of a growing number of investors incorporating these concepts of ESG, of environmental, social, and governance performance, into their very investment criteria. And 4th area, briefly at the end, encouraging country-level leadership and action. And I will focus on China, briefly on the US and Germany, and of course I hope in the discussion particularly we will talk about much more extensively on Brazil, where you are more knowledgeable than I am. It would be very interesting to see how these megatrends, what all this means for possible pathways for Brazil and future development choices. So let me start with energy. Transforming our energy systems is central to the entire climate challenge. It offers huge opportunities, I believe, for Brazil and other developing countries with enormous needs for power infrastructure investment. What is the ambition? Clean energy technologies genuinely competing with fossil fuels on performance and price, and not like so far mainly on subsidies. We are not far off from this competitiveness of the renewables in onshore wind and PV solar, and I will come back to that in the case of Germany later. The Inter-American Development Bank, in a recent study, shows that renewables, including hydropower of course, could supply all power needs long-term in Latin America. In a sense, Latin America could become the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy. Developing countries can leapfrog technologically and avoid many of the mistakes that we made in the developed world. They can future-proof, so to speak, their massive investments in future infrastructure and go directly to the latest technologies. And indeed, the clean energy sector has rapidly matured. The perception prevailing now also in the press that clean energy investment is not performing, but is not true, but it is a nuanced story, and I will come to the downside. It has actually demonstrated real upside potential. Global investment in the renewable sector grew from roughly 63 billion euros in 2004 to peak level of 317 billion in 2011, a five-fold increase. Costs have rapidly declined. Since 2008, the cost for solar PV photovoltaic has come down by 80%. Wind turbine prices down 30% in that same short period of time. The sector, of course, at the moment faces challenges. And a major consolidation in the renewable sector is happening, leading also to stagnating investment. There is enormous manufacturing overcapacity, and solar probably 50% overcapacity. You see mergers and you see exits from the market. The sector is consolidating, however, with all these mergers, bankruptcies, and others. Some governments are reconsidering the nature and the extent of their policy support. For example, feed-in tariff subsidies, which of course the worst thing you can do for the investment community if you cannot rely on policies that are transparent, that have longevity, and that are credible. Spain is a recent bad example. So we've seen for the last 2 years clean energy investments declining somewhat. But still, a promising future clearly lies ahead. Renewables create more jobs per megawatt than fossil fuel of energy. Distributed generation in India and other places, Brazil, can resolve grid issues and reduce blackouts. Solar PV is already cost competitive in 10 US states, in Chile, probably also in Brazil. I haven't seen the numbers, given your fairly high domestic power prices. At Deutsche Bank, we estimate that by 2015, much of the clean tech industry will have matured and consolidated and will take advantage of these cost competitiveness. It's interesting, just as an aside, that a country, the major oil producer in the world, no, not quite anymore, the Americans are now vying for that position, Saudi Arabia, has launched a 41 gigawatt renewables clean tech project, mainly solar, for 2025. And here, interestingly enough, it's driven by their realization that heavily subsidized power and oil lead to rapidly increasing demand. And one way to keep the hydrocarbons for future exports is to go locally into renewables. It's something interesting to watch, and it's, of course, a huge investment volume that will drive the markets. What should then policy do in addition to drive and accelerate this vision of a renewables world? Four steps. I mean, obviously the big one, but politically extremely difficult, is a smart reform of fossil fuel subsidies. According to International Energy Agency, only 8% of the more than 500 billion these days globally in energy subsidies go to the poorest, only 8%. The IMF argues that fossil fuel subsidies now clearly aggravate deficits, look at Egypt, India, and others, crowd out public spending, discourage private investment, and encourage enormous waste, of course. And I think one major vehicle here, and we have BNDES in Brazil, is to ensure that development banks help maximize private investment through de-risking, through leveraging up with public money, private investment, to de-risk investments and not subsidize. So a big shift from subsidizing through government budgets to using development banks and other mechanisms to de-risk. And obviously, as far as the poor are concerned, I'm quite involved in Egypt these days. It's much more effective to have social safety nets, to have direct income transfers, than indiscriminately subsidizing all across. And it's actually one of the answers to what Egypt has to do right now. That's one step to accelerate the transition to clean energy. The second one, again, and I have no illusions that it's politically extremely difficult. The G20 has talked about it. We have talked about safety nets, but India has recently actually reduced somewhat, but not much yet to write home about fuel subsidies. But it is politically an enormously difficult path. But clearly, it's not a level playing field with renewables because you subsidize the carbon. And that brings me to my second step to accelerate this mega transition. Carbon pricing is, of course, the most effective policy. Whether this is through cap and trade regimes or carbon taxes, there are many ways. The OECD recently came up with a very interesting statement by Angel Gurria in that direction. We need necessarily a playing field for all technologies. And we need a reliable carbon price then in these countries. I'll come back to the European ETS later. And the private sector will then do the job. Give me a carbon price and the private sector will. We have to finally accept that the global externalities of climate goods have to be priced adequately up and down. I'm encouraged by the fairly large number of countries now that are moving towards some sort of carbon pricing system, even if most of this is still on a pilot basis. For long-term investment decisions, this is beginning to be relevant. There are 16 countries or regions, including Brazil, which are working with the World Bank to lay the groundwork for carbon pricing, tax or cap and trade. It is very disappointing that Australia, now with the changing government, is going backwards, because Australia in recent years developed some of the most innovative and sensible carbon trading system with a floor price for carbon, with a cap and trade system. I think it will come back, but it's the vagaries of the domestic politics that stops this at the moment. China has 7 regions, 7 provinces, big cities, which start pilots on carbon trading. And if we look at Chinese reforms over the last 30 years, they always tried with pilots. They call it, an old proverb, crossing the river by feeling the stones. They're doing this, by the way, now also in the financial sector with Shanghai Free Trade Zone. And I would give importance, particularly in Guangdong, where the pilot is most advanced, that they are experimenting now with carbon pricing. California, we say the US is doing nothing. California is trading on carbon and will link with Quebec. The US Northeast market of electricity providers, this is company-driven, will propose to increase stringency. South Korea will officially launch an 18-month carbon trading system, and pre-compliance trading has already started. 40 national and 20 subnational jurisdictions are in this planning node. And I've talked about Germany later, but the European ETS was, of course, path-breaking in that. Unfortunately, for a number of reasons, recession and others, the carbon price under this emissions trading system of the European Union is now all the way down and gives the wrong incentives and will have to be fixed. Now, I would argue that if countries like China, like Brazil, and other major emerging markets come to join Europe and others, Australia, to implement a carbon price, made the calculations, you could have 50% of global emissions that could be priced with the externalities. I think these examples illustrate also a very important principle. Let's not rely just on top-down international agreements like the UN framework, as important as they are. But let's go ahead with small coalitions of like-minded, of willing countries, companies, cities, to put bottom-up pressure to complement the top-down negotiations. So that's the second one beyond to accelerate the energy transition. The third one, and more controversial, is of course the role of natural gas. With the huge finds of shale gas, and I believe if you have strict regulation on methane, on use of chemicals, on the technology, on water use, it is a credible way to go. But it has to be remain, if you talk long term, a bridging technology. It cannot relieve the pressure on decarbonizing eventually our energy sector, but it is a great bridge because it could replace coal, which is much more CO2 emitting than natural gas, and it could fuel, for example, capacity markets, standby capacity for highly variable wind and solar supply. Come to that in Germany later. And in that sense, I think the US shale gas revolution, which might also lead to a major reindustrialization and competitiveness advantage for the US, has its place if it's a bridge to a long-term decarbonized energy system. Very interesting question is whether the Americans will in the end agree, and this needs congressional approval, to export energy, export gas. I think some of this is happening pilot basis and will come. And of course it would be particularly important to get China and India off coal. Now the fourth step to accelerate energy transitions is innovative financing instruments and mobilizing the necessary finance through intelligent use of scarce public funds to leverage up private investment. Latin America only received 5%, I mentioned the big numbers a short while ago, 5% of global clean energy investment. Clearly there should be enormous scope to bring this up. To mention, I cannot be detailed on all the financial innovation that is happening, and there are many interesting structures working now. But let me just take one because it's so important for the energy transition, and that is US solar leasing, which Brazil could replicate. Simply put, there are companies now in California and spreading rapidly to the entire west of the US who come to you as a private energy consumer household. They have through GPS already a picture of what your location is, size of property, and within 2 days they make you a proposal how not buying PV solar for the rooftop, but leasing it, you could decrease your energy bill almost immediately. It is mushrooming. I was in California, talked to these companies. One is Solar City, they're also a client of ours, are leading the way. It's very rapid expansion. It's a no-brainer for these households. It's fast, it's clean, it reduces their energy bill, and they don't have to come up with $40,000 to put PV solar on the roof, which gets you to one of the big problems, investment versus variable cost in steam energy. This is just one example. It's now spreading beyond California, where you also have some tax incentives, to Arizona, to Colorado, to entire West. I think that's a brilliant way on how private sector can contribute. Now, we have some problems in the banking sector that Basel III and some of the tough conditions now on liquidity and capital imposed on banks after the financial crisis, mainly for very understood reasons, could stand in the way of some of the incentives that you need for these longer-term investments in renewables. And it will be very important to connect these investments to institutional investors and here's a role for universal bank. Now with these 4 steps, I believe we can see, and the necessary policy shifts, clean technologies on energy prospects very bright, and a major contribution to a decarbonized energy future. Subsidies, carbon price, finance, and so on. Let me come to my second point, which is the link between natural resource scarcity, climate, urbanization, and deforestation. And of course, I will have to be very limited in my remarks. Let's start with the fact that we will have in the next 20, 30 years 3 billion new entrants to the global middle class. I think this number is actually, in terms of what we are talking about, much more relevant than the fact that the global population is likely to increase from 7.2 billion to more than 9 billion. The demographers are a bit divided on how much higher it might go, but I believe it will not go much beyond 9 billion. But the 3 billion middle class, with all their purchasing power and lifestyle, are an enormous increase in natural resource demand. Developing new sources of supply, whether it's food, water, materials, will be difficult and much more expensive. Climate change, environmental impacts will of course limit the supply. McKinsey estimates we may need an additional 30 to 75 million hectares of farmland, present assumptions, to accommodate this new middle class. Resource prices are likely to increase, and I'm talking metals, rare metals, the whole thing, all the way to water, and become more volatile, which then in turn risks undermining growth. Improved efficiency, however, in using and producing our natural resources, given water waste, agricultural land, is the way to go and has good prospects. We have to measure, I think, most fundamentally, in future growth performance of the global economy also by natural resource productivity. In a sense, the same way we historically have measured progress by increased labor productivity. I think we need measurement on natural resource productivity the same way. Cities are, of course, the biggest resource efficiency opportunities. Efficient buildings, densification, efficient transport, local production, water leakage, consumer food waste, you can go on. I mean, it's a catalog of low-hanging fruit. Improved agricultural productivity, of course, is also critical, including for reducing deforestation. Just a few more remarks on each one of these. On the case for resource efficiency globally is based on the fact that the long-term trend of cheaper natural resource prices, it was a secular trend over the last century, have underpinned much of the economic growth paradigm of the world. But the last decade, as you know, has erased last century's falling resource prices. We have seen a major turnaround. Now we are at a point where it is much more difficult to supply to quickly meeting rising demand. I don't think there will be absolute shortages because markets will react by way of pricing. But resource price volatility has already increased in major ways, now 3 times higher than even in the early 1990s. And of course, the long-run marginal cost of developing new, whether it's in mining, whether it's in water, whether it's oil, costs are increasing. Just one example. Mining discoveries are flat despite a 4-fold increase in spending on exploration. The trend is setting in already. So, and what is also worrisome, you see much more correlation now between resource prices. They are increasingly linked. So the evidence that we may see higher and more volatile prices and that the resource price supercycle of the last century may be over is quite evident. Of course, these resources are also not priced according to full production costs. I mentioned some of this already, the energy subsidies, the carbon emissions. Interesting, the situation of Brazil in this global picture longer term. You could argue, of course, that as an enormously rich country in natural resources, Brazil is blessed with water, with land, with many of the other products, now even the pre-salt, that Brazilian exports could actually benefit from higher prices and from these trends. But I doubt the way the dynamics will work geopolitically, economically, that this will outweigh the negative impact on all, including Brazil, on resource the negative impact on resource importing countries on the global economy. And obviously it would disproportionately hurt the poor. So this all makes resource efficiency of critical importance. And in fact, we need more hedges, intelligent hedges in the real economy to hedge against rising resource prices in the future. Resource efficiency could now, on the positive side, also be a very significant growth driver if done well. in a sense moving us to a new paradigm of low carbon, no natural resource economy globally that some orthodox economists still don't accept will be viable in its incentives, but is clearly being debated and has, in a sense, we need a low carbon economics. And I would challenge the economist profession and Nick Stern, others, we are working on that in the international framework to make that case for this paradigm shift to low carbon, but also low natural resource economics. Just a few numbers. McKinsey estimated the benefits of resource efficient investments that it could meet up to 30% of future resource demand. So much waste do we have. Represent a $2.9 trillion value to society, could generate a more than 10% rate of return for society, and would create millions of jobs across many sectors. So here's the opportunity. These are McKinsey numbers. Cities and land use have the largest opportunities for resource efficiency improvements, but there are many other areas you normally don't think about. I mean, iron and steel production is still enormously inefficient. Look at the 1,000 steel producers now in China. Reducing material waste in electronics now on the internet is another big energy user. So there are many areas where this new paradigm would apply. Let me link that to the urban agenda for climate change. Of course, the critical role of cities in future, where majority of humanity now already lives, cannot be overestimated. McKinsey thinks that the cities will generate 80% of global GDP in this period. I talked about the new middle class. 33% of future growth, that's an interesting number, will come from the 100 largest cities around the globe alone, 33% of future growth. And 70% of greenhouse gas emissions come from cities and their resource demand on present trends. But this makes cities, of course, also the source of many solutions. And those who think most ambitiously about that actually is the new leadership in China. And I'll have a few words later on China. Of course, energy efficiency in buildings, free bread and butter measures, is the largest solution area. Our energy system is only 11% effective in producing the heat, motion, sound, and light that we need. Energy efficiency investment rivals levels in renewables and fossil fuels already now, but less spectacular, less talked about, and we need some better comparable data. Of course, the traditional split, because of the incentives, between landlord, who is not interested in investing in that, and tenant, who pays the variable cost, is a traditional barrier that is starting to be addressed. I mentioned the solar program in California. There are many innovations coming from the US and the UK. They started as pay-as-you-save systems, so you basically pay for what you do through the savings in energy. There is great potential to finance domestic energy retrofits through energy bills and involve the financial sector. Deutsche Bank, we are experimenting with many such funds. And I think Latin America should develop similar initiatives, including here in Brazil, where you have fairly high energy costs. Real estate property investors could play a greater role. There are more than 540 companies and funds now with $1.6 trillion in property assets under management who are comparing their action, are trying to coordinate lessons across, including, unfortunately, only 8 South American property firms and investors. Only 45% of real estate investors have a carbon reduction target. 33%, however, use green leases. I think strong growth in use of building labels, LEED and others, however, not allowing for too much variation in these labels, because then they measure often more effort and not actual performance is one answer. Urban designs are critical. US and Europe alone will have 80 million new dwellings until 2030. China will need to house in urban areas 300 million additional urban people. That's equivalent to building from scratch all the cities and towns in the US in only 25 years, when you think of it. in only 25 years. The China Energy Foundation, which I'm associated with through the European Climate Foundation network of climate works, is working with urban designers and architects. I talked about the ambitious plans of the Chinese leadership to create principles for livable, low-carbon cities. This is going on and is being applied by mayors in China increasingly in terms of building efficiency. I expect the new government in China, and they have said that already, Li Keqiang and others, will make new ways of urbanization, including the energy and pollution parts, of course out of necessity when you look at pollution levels in China these days, a high priority. So obviously whether it's mass transit, improving slum areas, water infrastructure, building retrofits, all these require massive investment and a vision for future urban design. Cities lack credit rating in many cases, which would give them better access to capital markets. The World Bank aims to help 300 cities to create low-carbon plans, including how to finance, including rating. We at Deutsche Bank have laid on a public-private climate fund that's still modest in its size, that is one working examples, where we fund, whether it's in China or in Latin America, local banks to expand their green lending, including to things, Mexico, like hybrid taxis, equipment for small enterprises in cities to meet the challenge. These funds share risk. I mean, you typically have a waterfall risk structure facilitating institutional investment, such as, for example, in one of our funds, you have the pension fund of German physicians, German doctors' pension fund, now investing actively their pension resources into these schemes. So the markets begin to move. Next week, Deutsche Bank will, and our Herrhausen Foundation, which is the foundation Deutsche Bank, will host an Urban Age conference in Rio, which will, I think, together with the authorities in Rio and universities, to showcase and spread smart city practices around the world. Let me, and the final point on this interlinkages is, of course, tropical rainforest. And there are so many experts, I'm sure, in this room who know much more about it than I do. I hope we come back to that in the discussion. Deforestation and farm production. 75% of deforestation around the world is driven by agriculture. Food production inefficiencies, waste, and diet choices contribute to deforestation. Expanding cities might pave over 30 million hectares of highest quality farmland by 2030. That is 2% of current farmland. North America throws away, just to give you numbers, these show the potential for savings. North America throws away 33% of purchased fruit and vegetables. 20 to 30% of food waste in the supply chain alone. In developed countries, typically doing packaging distribution. In developing countries, due to poor storage facilities. If China's meat consumption reaches US levels, you need 60 million hectares of new cropland by 2030. Unimaginable. A 20% shift of calorie consumption from meat to fish would save 60 to 80 million hectares of cropland, 2 to 3 times the UK landmass. So these are all numbers that show the potential for action. And of course, Brazil could further increase its already remarkable agriculture productivity. Embrapa's strong agriculture research over the decades has been important, but of course many inefficiencies continue, as you know better than I do. Grazing pastures support 1 head of cattle per hectare, which is quite low compared to other countries. You need a faster adoption of good farm practices, particularly crop rotation, so there's much to be done here too. And of course, improved agriculture productivity, and I'm careful, I'm saying may, not will, help reduce deforestation pressures and contribute to economic growth, because it has to be done right. This needs to reduce forest loss and not just expand exports, for example, of Brazil and other countries. Now, of course, you know about the progress that undoubtedly has been made to protect forests in Brazil and also in other regions. Don't have time to go into details. Better satellite monitoring and enforcement, which is, of course, very cost effective. We estimate $1 per ton of CO2 saved, I mean, this measure. more law enforcement capacity needed on the ground. Nature conservation areas have been designated and can be even more effective. And I think it's coming back to the private sector. There's now a large number of the global consumer goods industry companies who are committed, again, an alliance of the like-minded, to phase out deforestation in its supply chains by 2020. This is real stuff. Unilever, Paul Pullman, others leading. I think it's an excellent example of business leadership, bottom-up, that has major impact. Can you imagine phasing out deforestation in entire supply chains of the Walmarts, of the Unilevers of this world? How you do it, of course, the devil is in the detail, but that's the aim. And most fundamentally, from the economic and private sector perspective, I think these are the initiatives we need. Many forests are not under specific protection status, I'll see in Brazil. So you need to replace the economic drivers of forest destruction with alternatives. People need economically attractive alternatives and livelihood. And a massive research drive is needed on sustainable economic potential of all parts of tropical rainforests. The business community should engage to realize the value of standing forests. And ideas such as creating a rainforest business school to train in an interdisciplinary way rainforest managers on the value of and exploiting the economic potential of standing forests, which the University of São Paulo is sponsoring here, is the right way to go. Now let me then turn thirdly briefly to the innovative leadership and in finance that the private sector, investment and finance, that the private sector can provide, and I mentioned the examples already. How can we make sure, because that would then go into the trillions in terms of impact of finance, that the private sector economically benefits and contributes from improved, I called it ESG, environmental, social, and governance sustainability performance criteria. 80% of Fortune 500 companies are already producing sustainability reports, of course of greatly varying quality and commitment, but it's a start. The Global Carbon Disclosure Project sends requests to 5,000 companies on behalf of 720 investors with 87 trillion in assets under management, which is 33% of the world's invested capital, to inquire about their carbon disclosure. 2,400 of these companies, so almost 50%, and 1,700 supply chain companies responded to this in 2012. So these companies are beginning to realize the issue and make improvement. And the score necessary now to rank in the top 20% under this Carbon Disclosure Project criteria has gone up 47%. So it's becoming the competition for the top ratings top decile ranking from 2008 to 2013 shows the movement. Why is this also beneficial to companies? The new report of the Carbon Disclosure Project shows that the top 20% rated manager of climate risks and opportunities begin to have, I want to be careful, a quality premium in the perception of markets. They have a 5.2% higher return on equity, they have an 18% higher cash flow stability, and they have a 1.6% higher dividend growth. The market does not really recognize this premium yet, but here lies the opportunity. And how could that be done? Harvard studies show that responsible companies now increasingly, in this ESG sustainability sense, can raise capital at a lower cost. The market begins to value, also after this financial crisis, holistic risk management. And for example, avoidance of the risk long term that you might invest in stranded assets. Goldman study recently on coal as a stranded asset. I mean, these are powerful messages that the market sends. Company investor dialogue has increased, and when you look at annual general assemblies, AGM votes in recent years, it is a very powerful instrument in creating change. These investors intensively encourage companies to improve corporate governance and ESG risk management. 40% of US shareholder proposals at these AGMs were on these environmental, social governance, sustainability topics, 40%. So obviously boards and management begin to respond. There's an increasing number of companies who make specific commitments to more transparency, better oversight, and new targets, Ernst & Young studies. What more needs then to be done? I think one powerful way would be to have mandatory disclosure of material ESG, environmental social governance, factors and risks. You need integrated reporting, not just the financial reporting, but also, in a sense, ESG reporting. Second, disclosure and sustainability ratings have room to improve. These should be tougher assessments of which companies just pay lip service and which are really delivering, and the markets would watch that. And obviously you need, I mentioned the supply chain on the food industry, the retail, corporate leadership and alliances. What is then the impact of growing number of investors incorporating ESG issues in investment criteria? I think the impact is that responsible investment is clearly growing. 1,200 investors with 35 trillion assets are now signatories to the UN principles for responsible investment. It includes 60% of Brazil's pension funds and other investors. In 2006, only 100 investors were signatories. Globally, about 20% now, we estimate, of assets under management have some of these sustainable criteria or screening applied to their operations. Our research shows, academic research included, that these ESG investment practices can reduce risks and volatility. It can lead to outperformance of these companies. And further investor engagement with companies can create benefits. CalPERS, the huge California pension fund, set a focus list of 155 companies they're investing in where they look after these criteria. So I think one can demonstrate that it has an impact. The next frontier, I think the role of stock markets and more broadly the investment strategy can be enhanced. It is encouraging that it was announced actually at Rio Plus 20, I think, that Bovespa, the Brazil stock market, is one of 7 exchanges that is encouraging companies to disclose environmental, social governance, ESG performance. I think that's exactly what we need, stock exchanges requiring that for listing, etc. There are now 293 Brazilian companies who publish sustainability reports, 60% of the companies on that exchange. It would be interesting to hear from you what the experience with that has been. While these are all, I think, impressive and positive developments, I don't want to be misleading. They are only just the beginning, and the huge challenges to bring the private sector fully in remain. And here I would like to set a leadership challenge for Latin American companies for responsible investment. Latin America's investment community, and I know the IADB and others thinking about that, should aim to expand the understanding and use of responsible investment practices and lead the way. Let me finally come to the country level. I mean, some examples of alliances that should encourage or should supplement the UN negotiations. It is no question that a certain smaller number of countries will have to go ahead and not wait for UN agreements, provide leadership at the country level. There are now many developing countries that are creating green growth action plans, but in these, when you add them up, of course, there's still a very significant emissions gap, so to speak, between, quote, allowed emissions under these plans and sufficient strength of climate policies to add up to something that moves the needle on global CO2 emissions. The IPCC, the report just came out, concludes that to have a 2/3 chance of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, The carbon budget is, of course, 800 gigatons. 2/3 of that carbon budget has been used already, so that's why we don't have much time to lose. And it will be critical whether governments agree to a new climate treaty in Paris under President Hollande's leadership, COP 2015. The UN Secretary General will hold, importantly, next September, a year from now, already a special leaders summit around the world in September 2014 to give impetus and leadership to the 2015 negotiations. Let's not forget, governments are also aiming at present to replace the Millennium Development Goals, some achieved, with Sustainable Development Goals, zero poverty by 2030, food security, water access, related issues. They are separate but related UN processes. But my honest judgment is it's very uncertain whether the UN framework of everybody in the room negotiating will, in the end, succeed. And therefore, this top-down UN process needs greater bottom-up action of those who go ahead and lead. I highlighted many promising actions that could be reinforced. The bottom-up actions are clearly also insurance, which would be a disaster if the UN process fails in 2015, and there's nothing else to fall back on. So you could have a whole string of activities and alliances that carry things forward. So in a sense, it's also geopolitical insurance policy against UN failure. And again, it's not just countries. It can be the 40 cities that have formed the network. It can be the companies I mentioned that go ahead. And in fact, the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, is now convinced that this has to supplement or complement his process, and he's very much looking for corporate commitments and of the nature I outlined at the Leaders Summit, where he wants to bring actually the business leaders much more into the room. I've been at some of these COP negotiations where then business communities, the B20 and others in the G20, they are being listened to, but they're not part of the debate. I think you have to bring the leadership of the corporate world much more centrally into the room, so to speak, when the negotiating process is going on. Boardrooms are often ahead of government cabinet rooms in their thinking on these issues. Perhaps some of the ideas I mentioned could be picked up by these corporate commitments and lead to the summit next year. Not to be too long, let me just say in a few words on action at the country level, what China, US, and Germany are doing at the moment, and I'm sure we will come to Brazil also in the discussion. China's clean air crisis is clearly now accelerating as an absolute political must. Their action not only on urban pollution, but also on climate policy. We have done some analysis of the measures that are being contemplated, and some have been adopted already to improve air quality. China could cut its coal consumption growth in half, very important part of the pollution in places like Beijing and Jinan. It's not just urban emissions, it's the whole surrounding areas where coal is used. Coal, we believe, I would not be surprised if the Chinese set a much more ambitious target of peaking the use of coal, I mean in absolute terms, already by 2017, a decade earlier, almost a decade earlier than previously forecast. China is already the largest clean energy investor globally. In June, the State Council published very far-reaching new policies and targets, but they are only the start. I've just come from China, and I can tell you that the sustainability issue permeates much of their thinking, from urbanization to pollution to taking leadership. And what I like to argue with the Chinese, who have always a longer-term historical view of things, why don't they turn, once they are ready to do for domestic reasons what they have to do anyway, to then translate that also international leadership? Turn it around, challenge the US and others, and Xi Jinping and Obama started talking about that in California a few months ago. Turn it around. China saying, we are doing it, but where are you, US? Where are the other countries? So rather than being defensive, being proactive. And I think these thoughts are not entirely extraneous to the Chinese leadership. So perhaps we will see more leadership coming from China in coming years than expected. And again, Xi and Obama, I just heard it in Washington, there are many working groups now coming out of this meeting they had in California in this whole area we are discussing here. And those responsible on the American side are saying the Chinese side clearly has the instruction to be constructive, to be accommodating, not just to defend, but to push. So perhaps that goes forward. Which brings me, of course, to the United States, the main stumbling block in all of that. The challenges of a dysfunctional government we all experienced the last few weeks apply here too. Obama's recent climate action plan is not bad. Focus is obviously on regulatory action because you cannot get anything legislative through Congress. But these EPA regulations are and can be tougher than climate legislation in Congress. Of course, there are many legal hoops, how they are being challenged in court cases, which that have to go through. The plan has some interesting adaptation, not just mitigation, but adaptation targets after Sandy and all the other events. I think the Americans are waking up. The US, I mentioned examples, is very innovative in financing, solar leasing, on-bill energy efficiency programs, which could also be applied globally. You go to Silicon Valley, also technology front, you wonder why the US is policy-wise asleep at the wheel, because they would have an innovation machine to drive the new technologies and take advantage of the new incentives like nobody else in the world. So the Chinese are happy, I think, that the Americans are asleep at the wheel until they have made some progress there. But we know the US, I mean, things can also change over shorter periods of time than in other countries. But at the moment, of course, it's not a good picture. I talked about shale gas and vehicle efficiency standards, which change the landscape. Vehicle efficiency standards contributed to 12% reduction in carbon emissions over the past 5 years in the US. That's quite sizable. So ironically, through recession and some of these developments, shale gas, the US is actually likely to meet its Kyoto objectives of having done nothing on the legislative side. Let me mention, but I don't have time, the US military. I find it fascinating how the military, thinking more strategically, also from obviously from an energy security angle, supports clean technologies. Of course, they know they are one of the biggest users of oil and very energy inefficient. They see future conflicts around this theme if things don't move in the right direction. The US military has massive renewable spending now, 1.8 billion in these years already. And as Amory Lovins has pointed out, I mean, the military in American history often spearheaded or supported new technologies like jet engines, microchip, the internet, which then matures. It's just an aside. I not expect the answers to come from there, but it is an interesting aspect on how complex the American scene are. On Germany, we are in coalition in negotiations. I think we will have a grand coalition. The good news is that both on Europe, but also on the Energiewende, the very ambitious energy transition Germany has set for 2022, there's no difference in views across these parties. So I don't think people will go backwards. The continuation will be there. And as you know, it aims enormously ambitiously to phase out nuclear by 2022 and cutting emissions by 80 to 95% by 2050, the roadmap for Europe. Much policy detail remains to be worked out. In fact, there are many problems now, missing transmission systems, lines. The same people who want to get out of nuclear and into renewables don't want to have these transmission grids in their backyards, the local communities, the usual problems. And we will need intelligently address each one of these issues one after the other. To just mention one or two, how will the future power market work if you have more than 40% already in 10 years? Even this, we had days this summer even where solar and wind alone provide more than the big industrial machine of Germany used in a day. These were, of course, isolated days where the wind was blowing and the sun was shining, but it shows the dimensions of the renewables revolution in Germany. And in 10 years, we will have more than 40%, 43% will be renewables. Now, this is wonderful news, but creates enormous problems how you run the system. You have to develop, for example, standby capacity, the so-called capacity markets. Individuals will have to be willing to pay for standby capacity, gas-fired or whatever that might be, and not only for electricity received. You have the problem of high variability, almost zero marginal cost of these renewable installations, particularly onshore PV and wind. And at the same time, you have to pay for the capacity. We believe, don't ask for the solution lying in stationary power storage in the foreseeable future. Even if technologies are advancing rapidly and that's of course a big prize if you can make power storage economic, but it remains, I think, for foreseeable future, the next decade or two, a very expensive way to create flexibility. So whether it's distributed generation, whether it's the standby markets in our calculations, this is the way to go. And securing sufficient supply in that will not cost much. And obviously, often forgotten also in Germany, energy efficiency investment can do much of the job. But this we see in the domestic debate now, how to optimize between energy security, affordability, and obviously carbon impact is not an easy occasion. Let me just mention we will reform the feed-in tariff policies that Germany pioneered 10, 15 years ago. And I think that will also be an interesting message for the European scene, where we badly need to, with the collapsing EU carbon price, to reform the ETS. I think the new German government will support that, whether it's backloading, the Commission proposing right now, or a more fundamental overhaul, we will need to see. All countries basically are in favor, except Poland, who is the outlier now in Europe, relying heavily on coal and making life more difficult. So let me stop here. I try to put forward how important a constructive sustainability vision can be, also for the private sector. Obviously, we didn't talk about it. People's attitudes matter enormously in all of that. So we need more of a sustainability culture, not just in business and government, but much more across education, science, art, and technology. This is the kind of future that clearly prudent, innovative, and courageous leaders, policymakers, citizens, the business community should coalesce around. I tried to illustrate some bright spots and trends that exist technologically, politically, in the business community and the investment world. And I think there are seeds and elements of optimism that for the future that can build on all of that, on clean energy, on the natural resource scarcity, and particularly also the growing number of investors incorporating these criteria, which could move trillion-dollar markets if done right. And finally, countries going ahead, leading, not waiting for the UN. Thank you very much.